we're about 10 or 15 years away from the first trillionaire, and there's not going to be one.
Who do you think it'll be, the first?
At this point, the numbers would suggest it's Musk who is on track for that. But as we've learned from even Musk's own life, because of the wild swings and rapid growth, it could be somebody that we barely know about today.
Evan Osnos, thank you for joining me on The Golden Age.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Andrew.
So I want to talk about the book's title and its inspiration. Americans have a very complicated relationship with wealth. We idolize some of the wealthiest figures. We love the American dream, this idea of going from nothing to, maybe even one of the world's wealthiest people. But at the same time, we also hate inequality. What do you make of that tension?
It's baked in really at the root of who we are. I think some of that is attributed to our origins. After all, we in a sense fought our way out of aristocracy. That's the self-narrative. And I think that has a very durable effect. I mean, when we talk about the American dream, it is about the idea of being able to go from nothing to extraordinary wealth and success. But at the same time, Americans are allergic to certain kinds of very obvious bits of unfairness. And so there's a tension. And look, we should stipulate all the obvious things, Andrew, which is that, the United States has never been a pure demonstration of the Platonic ideal of any of these things. However, there is a sort of direction of travel and an orientation. And I think that that's kind of the tension, is that people want to be able to get rich, and they are frustrated by the sense that there are obstacles in their path that don't feel fair to them.
And I agree, we've always had this tension, but it feels like the scale of inequality is something that we've never seen before. Can you quantify that for us?
Yeah, in a sense, the scale is what is scrambling our brains, because to put it in very precise terms, there were 66 billionaires in the United States in 1990. Today, there are more than 800. And even in more abstract ways, things that perhaps you don't see, they're not visible on social media, but as a practical fact, the percentage of America's wealth that was controlled, for instance, by a tiny number of people was about 7% a generation ago, and now it's about 18%. And that means it's coming from somewhere. It is ultimately, at this point, a zero sum how the pie is divided. And so there is a way in which the sheer amount of money in the hands of a small number of people has been accumulating, almost like climate change in the background, with us aware of it happening, but not perhaps conscious on a day-to-day basis.
And how is it happening? Because we all have access to the S&P 500 and the idea of compounding, but for this class of investors and people and entrepreneurs, it seems like their wealth is just, it's compounded at a much greater velocity and force than the average American. How is that possible?
Well, I mean, to some degree, there is actually just a mathematical logic to the fact that compounding does help you the higher you up on the curve. So yeah, you and I are receiving our compound interest on our investments, and that helps us. But at a certain point, if you are already pretty wealthy, if you do, in a sense, nothing, you will continue to grow as an extraordinary absolute fact of your wealth. And look, there are also, and this is the part that is less often said out loud, there are tremendous opportunities that accrue to you when you enter a stratosphere, because, for instance, you start to get access to early stage investments that can be much more high performing than the kind of S&P 500 opportunities that you mentioned a moment ago. You're also able to take advantage of much better tax advice, which will, for one thing, tell you that the first thing you should do is get rid of any income, because we have an income tax. We don't have a tax on wealth and assets.
Not yet.
Not yet. And I think that's actually a crucial distinction. I mean, if you're somebody who gets up every day and you go to your job at, an insurance brokerage, and you bring home a decent salary, that money is taxed at a pretty high rate by the government because of income tax. But if you're somebody who was, let's say, born into a wealthy family, hasn't really had much of a job, and lives off of an existing pile of assets, you might pay very little in tax. This is not, I'm not making a like a general point. During the pandemic, according to ProPublica, there were 18 billionaires who managed to qualify for COVID relief because their income was so low. In fact, Jeff Bezos at one point, again, according to ProPublica, was able to qualify for a child tax credit, even though he was already a billionaire many times over because he was so expert at keeping his income low.
And is the speed with which these billionaires are accumulating wealth, is that unique to America, or is that happening globally as well?
There is an overall global updraft. It is certainly true that billionaires are accumulating more and more, but the United States stands apart in the sheer scale and speed with which it has happened, to the point that I have been talking to archaeologists, people who study this back to the Neolithic era. And as one of them said to me, the people who built the pyramids were living in a less unequal society.
Mm.
I mean, as another one said to me, the question that we're really asking here is, was Elon Musk, or should I say, is Elon Musk richer than Tutankhamen, the King Tut of tomb fame? And that person said, look, it's hard to do a one-on-one comparison. But the fact that we're even having a conversation about comparing current levels of wealth with pharaonic level of wealth gives you a sense of how people with the widest aperture of comparison are thinking about it.
And I think it's something you've talked about. How much was Elon Musk worth at year one of the first Trump administration?
Elon Musk was worth about $10 billion at that point, and he's now worth at least $400 billion, which is a level of growth that's really mind-boggling. I mean, consider the fact that 10 years ago, there was nobody on the planet worth more than $100 billion. And now there are at least 15 people who meet that description. And that number is going to continue to rise. We're about 10 or 15 years away from the first trillionaire, and there's not going to be one.
Who do you think it'll be, the first?
At this point, but I also... At this point, the numbers would suggest it's Musk who is on track for that. But as we've learned from even Musk's own life, because of the wild swings and rapid growth, it could be somebody that we barely know about today. Just another, in a sense, ordinary billionaire who is in the right position of building that kind of extraordinary wealth by having control over the assets of a company that goes to the moon.
Sam Altman is someone that some people talk about as possibly being the first trillionaire.
Yeah,
is that something that
it's certainly conceivable. But this is another example of where, so Sam Altman could be. I think, though, it's also, remember, as we've talked about, that you benefit tremendously from getting a giant head start. So Musk was the most dramatic example of sudden growth, but it's also notable that somebody like Larry Ellison or Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, they're still in those high ranks, even though they're not people that we think of every day, simply because they started early. I mean, Warren Buffett has said that he's giving away money as fast as he can, but he can't give it away fast enough because he keeps making it faster than he's able to give it away. He's given away about 60 billion, and he still has about 160 billion. And as you know, he's in his 90s, and he's trying to give away more before the end of his life.
And I feel like the era of Buffett and Gates and the way that they viewed their wealth and philanthropy is just so different than the modern tech billionaire. Can you talk about that?
It is very different. There's a generational transition that has happened, a little bit out of our purview of attention, which is that the Buffetts and the Gates of the world, they promoted something they called the Giving Pledge, which was about giving away the majority of your assets if you were somebody with a huge fortune. But the people who have come after, particularly people like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Mark Andreessen, the venture capitalist, they talk quite publicly about some of their limited ambitions for philanthropy. They don't believe that they can have as big an impact with giving money away as they can through continuing to make it and invest it. So what their view is less emphasis on philanthropy and more emphasis on continuing to run their companies. Elon Musk has said that he thinks his greatest gift to humankind is being the CEO of Tesla. For that reason, his philanthropy is relatively less active.
You mentioned earlier the Neolithic era, but I want to focus on a different era, the Gilded Age.
Hmm.
When you look back at the original Gilded Age, do you think there are parallels between the wealth and inequality then and the wealth and inequality today?
Yeah, there are fascinating parallels between the Gilded Age of the 19th century and what we're living through today. Back then, you had the sudden advent of new technologies, things like the typewriter, the elevator, the telephone. They were really like transforming people's worlds. And at the same time, you had so much of the wealth from that going into a small number of hands that you actually had life expectancy for the poorest Americans dropping back then. And it was that huge divide of experience just day to day in terms of what it was like to go to work or what kind of healthcare you could have in your life that drove a huge amount of political unease and ultimately pressure for change. And it's not all that different from what we see today. I picked up the newspaper after all on Sunday and saw the banner that was in front of the crowd in New York City saying people over billionaires. There's a moment right now that seems to be an occasion in which people are, in a sense, looking past Trump as a source of their political distress and beginning to describe it more as a culture of ultra wealth.
Right, and that era gave rise to the progressive era, and you were alluding to that we could see maybe a similar uh, exit from this quote unquote golden age into maybe a more progressive age.
I do think that there is a similar trajectory at work, but it's very much an unfinished question about whether this period will give way to an era of reform. That's the pattern in American history. We saw it also in the 1920s, which gave way to the New Deal. But in order for that kind of pattern to repeat, it takes sustained attention by the public, by civil society, by investigative reporters. And these days, Andrew, people have a hard time keeping our attention on just about anything. And I mean, I'm not making a joke. It's a real question. It took many years to bring about reforms that ultimately helped the United States in the 20th century.
But one person who has garnered a lot of attention is Bernie Sanders and AOC going on their anti-oligarchy tour and sharing that message nationwide. Do you believe that that's a movement that can actually shift things and shift public sentiment?
I think the movement represented by Bernie and AOC has already had a much larger life in the second Trump term than people might have expected. The sheer size of the crowds that they're getting in Republican controlled areas is astonishing. However, Bernie Sanders is 83. AOC is in some ways less popular nationally than she is within the Democratic base and might have a hard time becoming a person who can reach across the aisle. I think that it's possible that there is room for somebody else who picks up elements of what Bernie and AOC are talking about, this very real frustration that folks have with the feeling that they're not able to tap into this culture of wealth, but perhaps has a cleaner slate politically or might even have a track record as a successful entrepreneur of their own.
And Biden, on his way out, actually warned about the rise of an oligarchy forming. And you've covered him extensively. I think he was directionally right, but what was he getting at in his speech?
It was a really remarkable speech. He said, and scholars will tell you this, it was probably the first time the word oligarchy has been uttered from the Oval Office in 250 years of American history. He warned about what he described as the rise of an American oligarchy dominated particularly by tech fortunes that could, in its way, crowd out the realm of liberty and democracy that has ultimately a tense relationship with big money. It was probably put best 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, by Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court justice, who said you can either have democracy or you can have giant fortunes in the hands of a few, but you can't have both. And there was a trace of that in the words that Joe Biden said on his way out of office. And it was interesting because in some ways, it was here was a Democratic president making an argument that actually has some adherents on the right as well. You see some members of the Republican rising generation, people like Josh Hawley or even Steve Bannon, who is not a young figure, but is somebody who speaks for that more populist edge, often voicing similar ideas about American oligarchy.
But I would say on the right today, at least in the MAGA part of the right, which is the overwhelming majority part of the right, there is an oligarchy that is seems to be just accepted as one. It seems pretty easy right now to buy access to the presidency. Has anything like this ever happened in American history? Obviously, we had the spoil system, but this feels like a different type of brazen possible corruption.
We're in uncharted waters now. I think the level and the brazenness of paying for influence and access to the government is on a level that we really haven't had in this country. And I think that, to give you a literal example, where I live in Washington, D.C., it's now pretty well known among people who work in government affairs or lobbying that if you want to have a group dinner with the president, that's available to you for $1 million, or you can have a one-on-one dinner for $5 million. And that money goes into the hands of a super PAC. But as one government affairs executive said to me, we don't know ultimately where that money is going or where it ends up. And that's, I think it's important to distinguish between the cynicism that, let's face it, a lot of people have about democracy in this country, who say, look, hasn't it always been a pay to play? And the reality of today, which is that we've entered into a completely different octave, a whole nother realm of the ability to actively buy your way into the office of the president
And
and
it's out in the open.
get your ideas. It's right out in the open. It's brazen. There was an old saying, Andrew, that wealth managers used to use. They'd say that the whale that never surfaces doesn't get harpooned. It was the argument for staying below the radar. But right now, I think part of the culture of this moment around Trump and his allies and his family is that there's no reason to stay out of sight anymore. Just be as brazen as you want to be about your wealth and your influence.
That's in contrast to some people you write about in the book, particularly the young billionaires, where there's this sense of fear among them. I'm talking about the doomsday preppers, the people who are building bunkers. They have private security forces, helicopters on their yachts. Where is that fear coming from, and is it warranted?
I think it comes partly from the fact that they have built literally the tools and the engines and the platforms that give them a window into American attitudes, because they're seeing it every day. I mean, as the CEO and co-founder of Reddit said to me, I could see in the early days of the financial crisis that things were beginning to go bad even before it was on the front page of the newspaper. So they have a heightened awareness of the fragility of America's cohesion. And then at the same time, I think there's something that happens when you get to be that super wealthy, you get that exposed in a sense, meaning you feel a kind of vertigo, a feeling of precarious exposure to the public that might be increasingly unhappy with you as jobs begin to dry up because of artificial intelligence, or you might be exposed to the whims of a president who, after all, doesn't feel particularly bound by the norms and precedents of law in Washington. So those are two ways in which you begin to say, I might want an escape hatch.
You mentioned the Reddit executive. Is that the same Reddit executive who had laser eye surgery?
That's right.
Can you tell us that anecdote and that story? It was a wild
Yeah,
detail.
yeah. Steve Huffman, who is the CEO and the co-founder of Reddit, told me that he had eye surgery, and it was not for convenience or for cosmetics. It was because, as he said, I don't want to have to depend on glasses or contacts in the event of a breakdown in the supply chain. He said, I rely on them. Without my glasses, I'm really in bad shape. And he went on to say that he has stockpiled guns and ammo and his motorcycles and food. And he imagines that if there was a breakdown in society, he could hole up at home and ultimately get out of town. And I think that he's not alone in that. I ended up talking to a large number of people in Silicon Valley and on Wall Street who have taken these kinds of preparations for some kind of social breakdown. And what was striking about it is, these are some of the people with the greatest opportunity and success who have succeeded precisely by their ability to look around corners and to anticipate where the economy is going. I think that part of what happens is that the same kind of mind that helps you succeed in that kind of work allows you to imagine utopian scenarios or dystopian scenarios. And so they are quietly making preparations for the conceivable worst.
How are crypto wealthy people different than maybe the traditional wealthy people?
I think that there is the rise of a generation of people involved in crypto, in some cases involved in super yachts or offshore finance, who really do regard the world in a borderless way. It doesn't feel to them as if geography is a particularly harsh constraint. You can live in one country, you can have your assets in another, you can be distributed. I mean, the reason why yachts are an amazing kind of image of that is that they are quite literally the physical expression of a world in which your assets can go with you or can be tucked away out of sight.
Well, you've written about how yachts are a great place to put excess capital. I think what is the starting? If you want to get a great yacht and entertain your billionaire friends and enjoy life out on the seas, what is that going to cost you?
Well, one CEO said to me that a yacht is the best place to absorb excess capital, is how he put it. He also said that it used to be that a 50-meter yacht was a pretty big boat. He said, but it's become those are sort of embarrassing now, meaning that the table stakes, the price of entry is going up in the yachting world. And you can still spend $100 million and perhaps be able to show your face in certain places. But it's gotten to the point now where to be one of the biggest in the world, if you want to run with the people like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg, you should expect to be spending at least 300 and perhaps as much as $600 million. And it's an amount of money that nobody would ever spend on a house. It's in a world of its own.
And what's the upkeep on that a year? So it's 300 to 600 just to buy the boat, but then how much is it to run the boat?
You should expect to spend about 10% per year to keep it afloat. So that means if you spend 300 million on your boat, you should expect to spend 300 per year.
30 per
And
year.
oh, excuse me, 300 to buy the boat and then about 30 per year. And part of that is, as the Financial Times once put it, there's just no way to describe a yacht as a good investment. It's like treading water with 10 Van Goghs held above your head, because a yacht is in mortal combat with the water from the moment it hits it. I mean, the water is trying to turn it to rust and sink it to the bottom of the sea. And you spend your time as the owner and as the crew trying to keep this paradoxical object afloat. And frankly, that's part of the satisfaction and part of the some of the experience of why people do this, because it does take a level of commitment and investment that separates you from the rest of the world. I mean, quite a memorable moment was when the owner of a huge yacht said to a guest, he said, look, you and I both have a driver, you and I both have a chef, we both fly private, but he said, the one way I can signal to the world that I am in a different effing category than you is the boat. And in that very small, high altitude world of super money, there is very much a kind of almost, let's be honest, a kind of high school cafeteria quality about the way that people are constantly kicking under the table to see who's in the lead.
It's very hard to get the ultra wealthy to open up in the way that they do to you. What is your secret?
It's no different than reporting on any other community. You just hang around a long time, talk to enough people, and you begin to understand the contours, the terrain, the vocabulary. And I'm lucky to work at a place like the New Yorker magazine, where we don't have to finish a story in a day or a week. We can spend months on it and travel all around the world. And you talk to enough people and they'll tell you about their lives. And that's the only way, honestly, to tell a story like this.
When you're talking to these people, do they believe AI is an accelerant for inequality, or do they believe AI is a great equalizer, giving everyone equal access to knowledge and ultimately wealth?
I think that they are deeply aware that AI is potentially the biggest disruptor to the labor force in our lifetimes and much beyond that. And I think that there is a reason why some of the biggest minds and fortunes in Silicon Valley talk about radical interventions like a universal basic income that might mean that nobody is left ultimately behind. But that's because they're deeply aware that it will ultimately concentrate money more intensely in a small number of hands. But they don't have an immediate proposal for fixing that. You've hit on a really interesting collision, which is that the fortunes and the technology are growing and accelerating faster than our politics and our society and our culture can keep up. Our institutions are, let's face it, created in the 18th century as a way of adapting to the economic and political needs of the United States in the 1700s. And all of a sudden, we're trying to figure out how Congress can make giant decisions to reapportion or figure out how to re-engineer the tax code and the wages of our time. It's really in some ways not a fair fight.
Can democracy hold under this weight? Is this level of inequality sustainable?
I confess that I do worry at times that we're reaching a point when the tensile strength of democracy is going to be tested. And I'm not being alarmist here. You could trust some of the richest people in America who have said, like Paul Tudor Jones, the hedge fund manager, that historically inequality of this scale leads either to war or to pandemic or to very high taxes, as he put it. And I think there is a way in which we are approaching a decision point because we've faced a similar decision in our past at the end of the Gilded Age in the 19th century. And we made a decision to veer slightly off of the path of business as usual and to make changes in order to prevent the gap between rich and poor from continuing to grow beyond any recognition. And as a result, we had the most prosperous century in human history, the American 20th century. So I think that it's a useful lesson to heed. We can make some changes to the way that money is accumulated and distributed without undermining the engine of American innovation, and perhaps might actually prevent ourselves from going down the path that we're trying to avoid. I mean, history can be a little haunting on this, Andrew. I mean, if you look at Roman history, what you find is that in the last years, a typical Roman farmer made about 5 gold pieces a year, while a Roman senator made about 120,000 gold pieces a year. Ramsay MacMullen, the great historian of Rome, was once asked, how do you explain the vast story of the fall of Rome? And he said, well, it took 500 years, but you could condense it into 3 words: fewer, have, more. That's the lesson that we're facing today.
I want to end on that great note. It's bleak, but I think that it'll leave people with a lot of questions and hopefully make people more engaged. So, Evan, thank you so much for joining us. The book is The Haves and the Have-Yachts. It's so good. Buy it wherever you can buy books. Thank you for joining me.
My great pleasure, Andrew. Thanks for having me.